Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to put this quick video on for you so that way you could get a little bit more information about the role of the Mongols, especially in China. This is a little bit of context for the debate that we're going to be having in class. Again, one of the resolutions really focuses on the role of the Mongols in China and to what extent they affected people within China, especially Chinese culture. And so some of this context is in particular about the reign of Kublai Khan, who's involved in China from the beginning of the Yuan Dynasty. And where we left kind of last class, we had a little bit of a discussion of kind of where the Song Dynasty was at when the Mongols invaded, and just kind of recall that this invasion is something that happens over the course of generations. Genghis Khan had invaded the northern part of China, what's run by the Jin Dynasty at this point. There's also Ogadai Khan, who's involved in some other sections of the Jin Dynasty. And then under Kublai Khan, there's a decade-long conquest where the Song Dynasty will fall to the Mongols, and the Mongols will essentially start the Yuan Dynasty. So every time you see the Yuan Dynasty, this is a Chinese dynasty, but really led by a foreign or outsider group led by the Mongols. So one of the slides that I have up currently is still just kind of a continuation of the discussion about where the Song Dynasty was. Remember that there's this giant kind of economic prosperity that's happening in the Song Dynasty. This is the Southern Song Dynasty, and that's something that's kind of ongoing at the time that the Mongols come to China. A great deal of the southern Song had been kind of dominated by these really geographic kind of areas that focus on particular products, and so the production is very, very oriented around these specific, kind of regions. And so there's a lot of local growth and a great deal of kind of geographic diversity that happens in the Song Dynasty. The slide that you're seeing on the screen, I think we talked about a little bit in class, but there is this really huge emphasis on the scholarly class in terms of that scholarly class being kind of the intellectual class, the literate class, and also having access to the government. The political power comes through doing well on the civil service exam, and based on how well people do, they might be placed at kind of the imperial government level, they might be placed at more the regional or local government level. Even scholars who didn't necessarily do well on the exam, kind of serve society as public servants or teachers. So there's a variety of different roles for these particular scholars, but it's like an emphasized kind of group in terms of the social hierarchy. There's also a good number of people during this time who are peasants. There's still a very large agricultural class, and that's kind of significant, but there's also a great deal of urban life within the Song Dynasty, and that's something. There's also, we kind of emphasize some changes in some of the maybe intellectual class, because there's like renewed debate over some of the classical, kind of Confucian ideals, and as Confucianism kind of mixes with some other maybe more new to China belief systems, there become some ways in which there are questions, and maybe Confucianism becomes a little bit different, especially under some particular intellectuals. And so we talked about that a little bit. And one of the things that we notice about Neo-Confucianism is this idea that intellectuals kind of begin this process of self-improvement, which becomes a focus of people kind of thinking that they can ultimately improve themselves and then bring that improved self to the larger society. So there's like a community asset in having improved oneself. So this concept of gentleman takes on a certain meaning during the Song Dynasty. Okay, this also incorporates a great deal of like finer culture in terms of art and things like that. So this is a map of the Yuan Dynasty at the time of the conquest, and I don't have a great deal of information in here about the conquest. It is something that's like heavily focused on, and there's actually debate amongst the Mongols about how to conduct this conquest and how much there should be once China is kind of conquested, how much the Mongols should stay. There's actually a group of Mongols who will leave China, go back to Karakoram, and kind of refuse to be a part of this settlement and refuse to be a part of the rule of China. But starting in 1279, Kublai Khan will name the new dynasty and see himself as kind of a legitimate ruler who has the mandate of heaven, kind of is accepted by the Chinese people. And to some degree, there is some members of the Song society who do see the connection with the Jin dynasty, kind of putting China together again as something that's valuable. But this is a conquest, like hands down is a conquest, and a great number of people in the Song dynasty will fight the Mongols for a good amount of time. The Mongols do use some naval battles to win over the areas of the Chinese and ultimately take over Hangzhou, the leading Song dynasty city, and they will move the capital of the Yuan dynasty to what they call Dadu, or modern-day Beijing. So Kublai Khan, who's the grandson of Genghis Khan, not the son of Ogadai, so it's not like a direct, son type of thing, but he is the grandson of Genghis Khan. There's a couple of things that I'm just going to emphasize about the rule of Kublai Khan, and I'm not going to necessarily evaluate it because part of the goal of the debate is to encourage you guys to think about some of the consequences of some of these policies, but in a broad sense, there's some ways that the Mongols, and Kublai Khan in particular, will be raptured by some of the Song dynasty's ways of life, some of their governmental system, and the Mongols will kind of incorporate a great deal of the Chinese way of life into their system. So they take the entire secretariat system, they take the entire governing infrastructure and essentially move right into it. So Kublai Khan will see himself as a Chinese emperor, will kind of follow along in that capacity. At the same time, there are some rules in place that are added by the Mongols that actually are different for different groups of people. So Mongols, people of Mongol heritage who are settling in China, have different rules to follow than the aliens, this next group of people who maybe are going to be representative of people like Marco Polo, who are Italian or Persian, or different people who are kind of working for the Mongols, but from other maybe parts of their empire. Then there's also Northern Chinese, the people who are seen as not necessarily the ethnic Han, but maybe the Jurchen people. They are kind of next on the social hierarchy, and then there are specific laws that affect the members of the Song dynasty. So just keep in mind that there is kind of this geographic type of distinction, that an ethnic type of distinction that the Mongols make. Kublai Khan in general is very, very much like, he's highly educated, is very appreciative to some degree of the classical Chinese, kind of intellectual culture, but he's also a little distrustful of it. Part of this is probably to protect his own political power. There's a great deal of challenge that the Chinese intellectuals could present. They are the ones who held the political power and held a great amount of kind of the significance politically in society. At the time of the change to the Yuan dynasty, one of the ways that Kublai Khan will try to reject the power of the literati class is by eliminating the civil service exam. So that conduit that individuals had to try to come into the government through doing well on the civil service exam no longer is available. And so it's kind of a shakeup for this particular group. And ultimately, there's some other techniques as well that the Mongols will use to kind of minimize, not completely reject. So it's not that the Mongols disallow Confucianism, it's not that the Mongols disallow the literati class from having any type of role in the governing system, but the roles are minimized, and there's kind of a rejection of them as significant political figures. There's also a kind of, some laws that are in place to protect some of the Chinese way of life. There's also some laws that are in place to protect the Mongol way of life. So the Mongols will bring with them some of their native habits, pasturing. Women have completely different cultural norms than Chinese women, and there will be different sets of laws, and in some cases the laws suggest limitations on both groups. So for example, Kublai Khan sets up a law where the Mongols can herd, they can have animals, but there's a limit to how much they can. There's also some historians who do argue that Kublai Khan, especially in the beginning of his reign, is particularly helpful to peasants through a variety of agricultural policy, maybe organizing farmers, helping them be a great deal more productive. We know that the Yuan dynasty ends largely because peasants are overtaxed and will rebel. So how much peasants are helped is kind of dependent on where you are in the timeline of the reign of the Mongols. It's not a lengthy dynasty, but it does go on past the death of Kublai Khan. One thing that Kublai Khan does immediately is bring in kind of a layered bureaucracy. So you have these people known as the Semuren. The Semuren is kind of individuals who are essentially deported from other places within Mongol society, and they are hired as administrators. And in particular, Persians were known for having really kind of diligent organizational and administrative skills, and they were brought in to kind of serve as the public servants and in the role of government. So they're kind of replacing a lot of the literate class, and the Mongols, to some degree, aren't really involved in understanding, knowing, reading the classical Chinese, so they also are at a huge disadvantage. So they bring in people who ultimately also are not familiar with classical Chinese and have this rule that is on top of, like a layer on top of the Chinese classes. There is a really strong tax system. Something that Kublai Khan does is use the government actively. Some of those investments are things that are maybe very positive and things like infrastructure or whatnot, but of course some of his endeavors, including things like attacks on Japan or invasions into places like Vietnam, end up being very expensive and aren't always successful. Okay, in both of those cases there's not a success. There's also a great deal of investment in public works. It's also expensive, but things like the Grand Canal will get upgraded during this time, and sometimes we could argue that. The word corvée is something that's not necessarily unusual at this point in time, even in China, but the government will ask for temporary forced labor from different groups, and some people are exempt. Artisans would be one of those groups. So a little bit about the economy and the culture. There is a couple of things economically that Kublai Khan does, and remember, the Sung dynasty is a strong economic system when Kublai Khan, enters. So how much the Mongols actually contribute to the economy of China is debatable, but there is a attention paid to maritime trade. So Kublai Khan and the Mongols they're not really great on boats. Most of the time they get involved in some sort of marine military campaign. It's not necessarily successful, but ultimately they do invest a great deal in maritime trade. They also use a very active postal system. It's kind of a horse-ridden communication systems where riders, kind of take messages, from place to place, and the system stops are very well known. This kind of route also gets followed by merchants. So the communication system and the merchant lines are very, very protected and invested in heavily by the Mongol administration. So there's some more ports, so a great deal of trade between places like Persia, India, which is cranking at this time, and also China and other parts of Asia. And we do see a continuation of paper currency, some of the sophisticated banking things. New currency is developed, but of course the Sung dynasty also already had currency. And there are a great deal of economic investments and support of the arts. Kublai Khan in particular was interested in the arts, interested in culture, so he did emphasize the government's role in those types of things. There are, however, some cultural conflicts. So the biggest probably area of tension is between this literate class, probably representative of about 5% of the population, but a very, very powerful part of the population. Their kind of Confucian leanings and the way in which they had political power is now going to be kind of in jeopardy because of the way in which the Mongols are now calling the shots, especially with and in tandem with the Semuren. Some of the ways in which the Mongols will rule will not be in favor with the Confucians, and so there becomes cultural conflict. And something we actually see and how we know that there's conflict is some of the literate class will drop out of their governmental appointed positions that are essentially these weaker positions, and they find themselves in the arts. So these intellectual pursuits that include things like public debates, that include a great deal of things like playwriting and painting, and some of these kind of expressive types of arts end up being places where the intellectuals, the literati, will become very self-expressive and in a political way. So we see like this rhythm of descent